Listen to this. A routine patrol at the airport turned into a nightmare when a police dog refused to let a perfect family board their flight. His handler trusted him, and what they uncovered will haunt you. Rex wasn't just any K9. He was trained to detect danger. But no one expected him to find this. Have you ever witnessed an animal's instincts save the day? Share your story in the comments. That bark changed everything. But what happened next? Smash that like button if you believe heroes come on 4 paws. Subscribe to Fur and Friendship for more real stories of animals who refused to stay silent when it mattered most. The pre-dawn light filtered through the massive windows of Liberty International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. Travelers hurried past, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors, families dragging overstuffed suitcases, bleary-eyed tourists nursing coffee, businessmen barking into phones. Officer Jake Reynolds moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his K9 partner, Rex, trotting beside him on a taut leash. The Belgian Malinois was a veteran, his dark eyes scanning the throng with quiet intensity. They had worked together for 6 years, and Reynolds trusted Rex's instincts more than any scanner or protocol. Then, without warning, Rex stopped. His ears pricked forward, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Before Reynolds could react, the dog let out a single, thunderous bark, deep, guttural, reverberating through the terminal like a gunshot. Conversations halted, heads turned. Even the hum of the overhead announcements seemed to fade into silence. Reynolds tightened his grip on the leash. This wasn't Rex's usual alert for drugs or explosives. This was something else. "Easy, boy," Reynolds murmured, but Rex's gaze remained locked on a figure near the boarding gate, a man in a crisp navy suit, his posture relaxed, his smile polished. Beside him stood a small boy, no older than 6, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. The child's knuckles were white where they gripped the toy, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Reynolds frowned. Something about the scene didn't sit right. The man, Marcus Velt, according to his boarding pass, exuded confidence, but the boy beside him was frozen, his lips pressed into a thin, fearful line. Rex growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the leash. Reynolds hesitated only a second before stepping forward. "Sir," he called, his voice firm, "we need to have a word." Velt turned, his smile never wavering, but as Reynolds met his eyes, he caught something flicker in the man's gaze, something cold, and in that moment, he knew. Rex had just uncovered a secret, and the next chapter was about to begin. The private screening room was small, sterile, and uncomfortably quiet. Officer Jake Reynolds kept one hand resting on Rex's harness as the dog sat rigid beside him, his dark eyes never leaving Marcus Velt. The man in the expensive suit had followed them without protest, his demeanor calm, almost amused. But Reynolds had spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize the tension in Velt's jaw, the subtle tightening whenever Rex shifted closer to the boy. The child, Liam, sat hunched in a plastic chair, his stuffed rabbit pressed to his chest like a shield. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd entered the room. Reynolds flipped open the passport Velt had handed him. The photo matched. The stamps were pristine. The custody papers, signed by a California family court, bore all the right seals. On paper, everything was flawless. Too flawless. "Mr. Velt," Reynolds began, keeping his tone neutral, "you said you and your son are traveling to Amsterdam?" "That's correct." Velt crossed his legs, relaxed. "Visiting family? My sister lives there." Reynolds glanced at the boy. "Liam doesn't have his own passport?" Velt's smile didn't waver. "He's listed on mine. Minor children can be included under a parent's documentation." True. But Reynolds had seen enough missing child cases to know traffickers exploited loopholes like that. He tapped the custody papers. "This says you were granted full guardianship 2 months ago." "Yes. A private adoption." Rex let out a low whine. Reynolds hesitated, then turned to the boy. "Liam, is this your dad?" The child's grip on the rabbit tightened. His lips parted, but before he could speak, Velt smoothly cut in. "Officer, I'd prefer if you didn't badger him. He's been through enough." Reynolds held up a hand. "Just routine." He met the boy's eyes. "Liam, it's okay. You can talk to me." The boy swallowed. His gaze flickered to Rex, then, for the first time, to Reynolds. In that split second, Reynolds saw it. Fear, raw and unmistakable. And in that moment, he knew. The papers were lies, and Rex had been right all along. The fluorescent lights of the family interview room hummed overhead as social worker Nina Torres knelt beside the small plastic table. She slid a sheet of paper and a box of crayons toward the boy who called himself Liam, keeping her voice soft. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said. "But maybe you could draw something for me?" The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit in his lap. His gaze flickered to the door where Officer Reynolds stood with Rex, then to Marcus Velt, who sat stiffly in the corner, his polished smile now strained at the edges. Rex hadn't stopped watching Velt since they'd entered the room, his body tense as a coiled spring. Slowly, the boy reached for a blue crayon. Nina watched as he began to sketch, first a lopsided airplane, then a stick figure with two big eyes. When he added a second, taller figure beside it, she pointed gently. "Is that you and your dad?" The crayon froze mid-stroke. Across the room, Reynolds saw Velt's fingers twitch. Rex let out a quiet growl, low in his throat. The boy's small shoulders hunched forward. He picked up a red crayon with trembling fingers and scribbled violently across the taller figure, pressing so hard the paper tore. Then, in a whisper so quiet Nina had to lean in to hear it, he said, "Not my daddy." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Velt shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. He's confused." Rex moved before Reynolds could react. The dog planted himself squarely between Velt and the boy, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. The message was clear. Try it. Nina's hands shook as she turned the drawing over. On the back, the boy had written 3 shaky letters. M-A-T. Reynolds felt the pieces click together with terrible clarity. This wasn't Liam Velt. This was a child who knew his real name and was too terrified to say it aloud. The security office had gone completely still. Reynolds stared at the biometric scanner's screen, the blood draining from his face as the red alert flashed across the display. Matteo Rossi. Age 6, reported missing 68 days ago from Milan, Italy. The photo beside the alert showed the same wide-eyed boy now curled in Nina's arms. Only in the image, he was smiling, clutching the same ragged stuffed rabbit. Rex whined, pressing his muzzle against the boy's, Matteo's knee. The child flinched at first, then buried his fingers in the dog's fur as if anchoring himself to something real. Across the room, Velt's polished composure finally shattered. "This is a mistake," he snapped, yanking at his cuffs. "That system is faulty." "Shut up." Reynolds's voice was dangerously quiet. He turned to Matteo, crouching to meet the boy's eye level. "Is your name Matteo Rossi?" A tiny nod. "Do you know this man?" Matteo's breath hitched. His lips moved soundlessly before the word escaped in a broken whisper. "Bad." Velt lunged forward, and chaos erupted. Rex exploded into motion, his 85 pounds of muscle slamming into Velt's chest and knocking him backward into a chair. The man's scream was cut short as Reynolds wrenched his arms behind his back, knee digging between his shoulder blades. "Marcus Velt," Reynolds growled, snapping the cuffs tight. "You're under arrest for international kidnapping." Nina clutched Matteo tighter as the boy began to sob, not the silent tears of fear from before, but great, heaving cries that shook his entire body. Rex immediately abandoned his guard post to shove his head into Matteo's lap, licking desperately at the child's salt-streaked face. In that moment, the dam broke. Voglio la mia mamma, Matteo wailed, his Italian surfacing like a tidal wave. Per favore, voglio la mia mamma. Reynolds didn't need a translator. Every officer in the room understood. The rabbit, the terror, the name scratched on paper. This wasn't a custody dispute. This was a stolen child. The airport chapel had never felt so silent. Matteo sat on the carpeted floor, his small fingers tangled in Rex's fur as the dog lay protectively around him like a living barrier. The stuffed rabbit, now recognized as the sole possession his kidnappers hadn't managed to take from him, rested in the hollow between Rex's front paws. Officer Reynolds stood by the door, his phone pressed to his ear, listening as the Interpol agent on the other end relayed the final details. Sophia Rossi's flight from Milan lands in 40 minutes. She's got a police escort straight to you. Reynolds exhaled, watching Matteo trace the faded stitching on the rabbit's ear. The boy hadn't spoken since his outburst in the security office, but the terrified tension in his shoulders had eased slightly. Rex lifted his head every few minutes to nudge Matteo's cheek, as if reminding him, "You're safe now." Across the room, Nina Torres wiped her eyes discreetly. She'd spent the past hour showing Matteo photos of his mother on her phone, images Interpol had provided from Sophia's frantic missing person campaign. In every picture, Sophia's dark eyes burned with the same desperate hope Matteo now mirrored. The chapel doors burst open. Matteo's head snapped up just as a woman in a rumpled blouse staggered inside, her face streaked with tears. "Mio Angelo!" The scream shattered the stillness. Sophia Rossi didn't run, she fell forward, her knees hitting the carpet as Matteo wrenched free from Rex's embrace. The collision of their bodies echoed through the chapel, Sophia's arms locking around her son like she'd never let go. Rex, ever watchful, circled them once before settling at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Reynolds turned away, giving them privacy, but not before catching the moment Matteo buried his face in his mother's neck and whispered, "Ho tenuto Benny al sicuro per te." I kept Benny safe for you. The rabbit's name was Benny. And in that moment, Reynolds understood, this wasn't just a toy, it had been Matteo's tether to home. The retirement ceremony should have felt like a celebration, but Officer Jake Reynolds found himself blinking too fast as he knelt to remove Rex's service harness for the last time. The department had set up the event in Liberty Airport's main atrium, the same place where everything had changed, and now a crowd of officers, reporters, and curious travelers watched as the Belgian Malinois sat at attention, his dark eyes fixed on Reynolds' face. The metal around Rex's neck gleamed under the terminal lights, but it was the small hand suddenly clutching his fur that made the dog finally break protocol. Matteo Rossi, clean and bright-eyed in a new blue sweater, pressed himself against Rex's side as Sophia stood behind them, one hand resting on her son's shoulder. When the commissioner asked if she had any words, Sophia's voice shook only once. "This dog didn't just save my child," she said, her fingers tightening in Matteo's sweater. "He gave him back his voice?" Reynolds swallowed hard as he handed the leash to Matteo. The boy took it solemnly, then surprised everyone by dropping it altogether and wrapping both arms around Rex's neck instead. The message was clear. Rex wasn't a pet to be led. He was family. Later, at the Rossi's new brick-faced house with its fenced yard, Reynolds watched from the porch as Matteo raced through the autumn leaves with Rex bounding beside him. No commands, no harness, just a boy and his dog. The stuffed rabbit, Benny, sat propped on the porch swing between Reynolds and Sophia, a silent witness to how far they'd all come. "You know he still checks the windows at night," Sophia murmured, cradling her coffee. "Rex, I mean. He makes rounds like he's on duty." Reynolds smiled. Some instincts never retired. Inside, Mateo's laughter rang through the screen door as Rex playfully stole his mitten, the sound so different from the terrified silence of Terminal 4. The scars would linger, Reynolds knew. But as Rex dropped the mitten to lick Mateo's face, eliciting a shriek of giggling protest, it was clear the healing had begun. 1 year later, the Rossi household had settled into a rhythm of ordinary miracles, muddy paw prints on the kitchen tiles, a child's laughter ringing through the halls, and a retired police dog who still slept with one ear cocked toward the front door. Rex's medal hung in a shadow box above Mateo's bed, but the dog himself was usually found sprawled across the boy's feet, a living, breathing nightlight against bad dreams. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sophia was raking leaves in the yard when a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out wore a trench coat and an expression that made Rex immediately rise from his spot on the porch, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But it was the folder in the man's hands that made Sophia's breath catch, thick with documents, a single photograph peeking from the edge. "Mrs. Rossi?" The man introduced himself as Detective Moretti from Interpol. "We found others." Inside, over coffee that went cold, Moretti spread the files across the kitchen table. 5 more children, all linked to Velt's network, all recovered because of the case Rex had unraveled with a single bark. One photo showed a girl with pigtails hugging a social worker, another, a toddler asleep in his father's arms. Mateo, peeking over the table, pointed suddenly. "That's the lady from the airport." Sophia followed his finger to a picture of Nina Torres, her arm around a tearful woman. The caption read, "Reunited after 11 months. Rex nudged Mateo's hand, as if sensing the boy's trembling. Moretti smiled faintly. "Your dog started a revolution, Mrs. Rossi. Airports worldwide are retraining canines to recognize fear, not just drugs or bombs." He hesitated. "We'd like Rex to be the face of the campaign." Sophia looked at her son, at the way his fingers automatically buried themselves in Rex's fur. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, carrying the echoes of barks from the neighbor's yard. "No," she said softly. "He's already home."